I'm delighted to welcome you to the Tapestry Education Conference. The Tapestry and Foundation Stage Forum teams are really thrilled to have been able to bring together our highly respected speakers so that we can offer an opportunity for reflecting on the issues involved when starting the journey to become an anti-racist individual or organisation. We need to explore and have a deeper understanding of our unconscious biases and how each of us are products of our experiences and our encounters with others. There's much to do. As an organisation, we have just started the journey from non-racist to anti-racist, and we wanted to hold this conference to encourage others to start too. Or, if your work is already well underway, to encourage you to continue. I'm confident that over the next 2 hours, you'll be presented with a wealth of ideas and concepts, which will give you much food for thought. Some of those ideas will be uncomfortable to hear, but it's our overriding aim to give you the opportunity to reflect, both individually and with your families and colleagues, about anti-racism in the early years. I'd like to hand over now to my colleague Jules Mickleborough, who's worked so hard to organise this event.
Thank you, Helen, and welcome everyone. I'm Jules Mickleborough. I'm part of the education team here at Tapestry, and I'm the content editor for the Foundation Stage Forum and Tapestry, and I've been a teacher in nursery, reception and Key Stage 1.
Hello, thank you for that welcome, Helen, and also hello to you, Jules. I am Liz Pemberton, otherwise known as the Black Nursery Manager, and just under a year ago, I created and set up an anti-racist training and consultancy company called the Black Nursery Manager to really get the conversation and the action going with regards to anti-racist practice in the early years. I'm coming out of 16 years of early years education as a nursery manager. I also spent some time teaching childcare and health and social care as a secondary school teacher, and have also done some guest lecturing at universities as well. Really excited to be here. How do you feel, Jules?
Goodness, how do I feel? I feel excited, and I feel nervous, and I feel grateful. I feel really grateful, Liz, to you and to Faith and Shaddai for leading this conversation here today. Excited at the thought of all the conversations that will happen after this one out there with everybody listening to us and that need to happen. And nervous because it's such an important conversation. And Liz, I'm remembering back to our very first conversation way back last year. Do you remember you joined us on a podcast with David Kahn?
Indeed.
And at that point, I was a white woman who sat comfortably and unknowingly with my I'm not a racist outlook on the world. And I listened to you in that podcast, and we had a conversation afterwards as well. And I realized that my comfort and my not knowing were the problem, and that I needed to get over that white fragility, that kind of but I'm one of the good ones notion, and really look at how my white privilege has benefited me and how it is in everything that I do. And that's not been easy. I've reflected on my own practice, my past practice, and on the things I've said and haven't said and did and didn't do, and the impact of that. And I can't go back and change that, but we can move forward. And my white colleagues were having these same feelings in the education team here, listening to that podcast. And we came together and we realized we needed to do some work. And so we started to try and educate ourselves, and moving forward, try and bring that into the work that we do. It's really important to say, as Helen said at the beginning, that we are right at the beginning of our anti-racism journey. And it's not something where you get off and say you've arrived. So it's ongoing. Since then, Liz, this is just one of many conversations that we've had together. This is going to have to be a really short one. And I've really learned from your honesty. You've asked me questions that have helped me to reflect. and you've shared your experiences with me so that I can look at things differently. And during all of that, we were reflecting as a company on our own colour blindness as a majority white company, with us as white people who are making decisions, and also as a company that creates a product that helps educators connect with children and families and colleagues. What is our responsibility within the sector? And this event really came out of that. And so, Liz, I want to ask you the same question. How are you feeling in this moment?
It's really good to kind of have this moment to kind of recollect everything and to think about the journey, particularly between me and you as two individuals, but also in a wider sense, my journey throughout the early years sector and navigating that journey as a Black woman, as a Black cisgender woman. I always talk about the way in which I identify, because it really informs how I see the world and how I experience the sector that I am a part of. So when you ask me how I feel a multitude of things. I feel really excited about being here, about the fact that Tapestry FSF are doing this, putting this event on, that you'd invited me to co-present, to co-host. Part of me can't help but feeling it's quite bittersweet, because you almost feel like it's not too little too late, but you do feel like, wow, why has this happened now? And you can't escape the social climate. We can't escape what we've been going through, what we've been experiencing as a world, as a society, and also how the sector has no choice. The sector cannot ignore what has happened socially and the impact that that's had on all of the children and families, and some more than others. So when we start looking at, I guess, the disproportion of impact, the way in which poverty, structural and institutional racism, teacher bias, practitioners' engagement with conversations around race, anti-racism, and inclusion or belonging, we can't escape the fact that that has to be brought to the forefront of a lot of the conversations that we are having, and that we can no longer hide behind kindness. I talk about kindness a lot, Jules, you know this. And my real discomfort with kindness being used as kind of a pacifier, so a way of just excusing not talking about things which I think are absolutely necessary and are so urgent. And when you reflected on talking about that podcast that I came on when you'd invited me last year, I remember how I felt on that day. And I remember thinking, right, okay, I have more than had enough now. I've had enough of talking about this. I've had enough of experiencing this. Why should this be the way that it is in a sector where we're always talking about the unique child? Why are we only having conversations now? Or having conversations outside of the four walls of our, I guess, nursery environments or our own communities or the people that we feel most comfortable with? Let's move this really actively into a place of discomfort. And I remember coming to the podcast with that energy. And I remember as David was talking, we were going through some of the emotions that we'd felt as practitioners, but also what the intersectionality of our identities lent us to. And so I remember really being quite unapologetic, as I usually am, but not knowing you and just only interacting, I guess, via email. I thought, I wonder what you're expecting. And I always remember in the conversation you talking about or wanting to draw it to a nice, happy ending where the racial utopia has been achieved and we're all standing around the world holding hands and yes, we've solved racism. And I thought, God, how naive. But then I thought, what a privilege. How lovely it must be to feel and experience the sector in a way where we can just do a nice activity and then everything will be solved. And dismantling that as a concept and really saying, you want to have a little bit of a look at yourselves. We all need to do some internal reflection, yes, but some of us need to go on a journey which really holds us to account. And that's a very personal thing to do, but it's also something that cannot be wrapped up in courage or bravery necessarily. It just has to be done. And so there is no short answer to asking how I feel, because I just feel a multitude of so many things, but I'm so keen to get this afternoon started, and to really open up, as I said, this dialogue that will lead to action for us to explore some of the things and the concepts that we're going to be hearing about and discussing. And I guess I want it to really be the start of something, because I don't think early years has started yet when it comes to anti-racism. Early years has had a nice little ride in multiculturalism and diversity and celebrations. There hasn't been any real conversation or action about anti-racism and what that means. So, having really kind of reflected on that, that is, in short, how I feel. That is how I feel. Yeah, I think that's it, Jules.
Thank you, Liz. We did pretty well there. Normally our conversations are much longer than that.
Yeah,
we have a couple of kind of practical things to say before we pass on to the next part of the event. So just to say that a recording of the event and the presentations will be available on our website afterwards. And during the presentations, you're really welcome to type in a question into the Q&A section. You'll only be able to see your own question, but we will be collating those for the speakers.
Thanks, Jules. And also for everybody that's here, really want this to be something where everybody participates, everybody engages, everybody gets those questions in, but also on social media for the purposes of Twitter. The hashtag is anti-racist early years. Really keen for everybody to use that as a hashtag when we're talking about the event on Twitter or other social media channels. Right, so without further ado, as they say, I want to kind of introduce our first presentation, our first speaker, and that is Shaddai Tembo.
Hi everyone, yeah, thank you for that, Liz. And thank you to Jules and you, Liz, and the whole Tapestry team. I have to start off by just praising what a great run conference this is going to be and has been so far. I've never been to an event with so much preparation, but I'm really, really excited for this event and especially the Q&A afterwards. I want to respond to some of your points immediately. I'm going to pause on that and just get started with my presentation, if that's okay. So, race and racism in the early years. The first thing to say is welcome. What does it mean to address race and racism in the early years? Well, in light of the recent Black Lives Matter movement, I'm going to be addressing the contemporary climate surrounding race and racism before looking at how we can see those forms of discrimination and prejudice within practice within the early years settings. I'm going to outline some of the tensions in interpreting racism and work through the current policy context before sharing case studies intended to continue this discussion beyond the current session. A bit of admin before I start. It's not a how-to guide, so there's not really going to be a kind of checklist approach in this presentation. I really want you to think and go away in your own time. And you'll see in the top right-hand corner, there's a kind of camera image. If you're watching this back, this is a good opportunity to pause whenever you see those or take a picture of those slides. It's really, really important that we continue these conversations beyond my presentation today. I want to say that listening to me is not enough. You need to go away and do the work after this session. So my slides will be available afterwards. Absolutely use them, and just like me, that's absolutely fine. There's additional links throughout my slides as well, and there's time for questions and comments, as Liz and Jules said earlier. So I'm really happy to have a conversation about this and a discussion, and I think the Q&A afterwards will be really, really exciting. Who am I? So my name is Shaddai. I am a lecturer at Perth College UHI. I teach on the NC Level 6 Early Childhood Practice course. I'm also a PhD student at the University of the West of Scotland. My research currently looks at equalities in fully outdoor alternative environments. It's obviously quite heavily affected, hence the move to outdoor settings. I'm a former early years practitioner, so I started off as a level 2 apprentice in Bristol nearly a decade ago now. I've kind of worked my way up doing my foundation degree, topping up to a full degree in early childhood practice, my master's and my PhD. None of the stuff I am going to talk about today was taught on early childhood courses in England. It was really only through my master's and PhD that I came to understand how significant it is to talk about race and racism in the early years. So I'm really hoping to kind of share some of that knowledge with you today. I'm part of the Gender I projects and the Mighty UK projects. So they are around the gender diversification of the early years profession. If you're interested in that, I'd encourage you to check that out. I also am a trustee for early education and co-convening the SERA Early Years Network. I'm also a former child myself. I never know if that joke's funny or not, so I'm just gonna have to assume you're laughing. So today I'm going to look at the current context. Are we post-race? It's gonna take a step back from the last year with George Floyd, just look at a few moments prior to that and try and contextualize the current context around race and racism. Then we'll look at what is race and what is racism, how do we understand those terms? And there's a kind of tension here in understanding race as unreal in science, but also real in our social lives. So I'll look at a way in which we can understand those kinds of tensions. Then we'll move on more precisely to educational spaces. So we'll look at the kind of broad primary and secondary schooling contexts and how we can understand racism there, before moving more precisely to the early years. I want to look at the EYFSP assessments, ask you what's going on, ask you to pause there and have some thoughts and reflections. And then we're going to move on to practice, and the final part of this session, I've got 3 case studies for you. One is from Jane Lane's book called Speedy Joe. It's a really, really good case study. I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. And 2 case studies from my own research on Black educators working in predominantly white settings. And I'll try and do all of this in half an hour, but if I'm going too slow, please do stop me, Liz or Jules. Okay, so what is the broader political climate at the moment? It does almost seem stupid to say this given the past year, but absolutely before March 2020, there were real suggestions in the public media and political sphere that we may well have been post-race. People were pointing to Barack Obama's presidency, Meghan Markle's engagement to Prince Harry, that we may have transcended the conditions of race, that we lived in a now kind of multicultural society where race no longer mattered. I think the first thing to do, and this is why I have this at the start of my presentations, is just to dispel this myth. We are absolutely not in a post-racial society. And that's really, really clear when we look at the discrepancies between racial rhetoric, the way we talk about race and this kind of ideas of multiculturalism, but also the racial experiences. And in the past decade, as I'll come to show you, present conditions for Black and minoritized people have either remained the same or worsened under the current conditions. There's also this notion that racism has become more subtle. It's almost become more covert in recent years. I think that's true to an extent, but the other side of the picture is that it's become more explicit than ever. I think what we're seeing politically is a kind of far-right nationalist pushback against race and racism. So this was before the George Floyd protests. This was the Euro 2020 qualifiers in October 19, with the Bulgaria fans openly doing Nazi salutes in the England game. Racism is absolutely not covert. We need to be looking out for these sorts of things. It's really obvious in front of our eyes. What we're also seeing is from the American far-right nationalistic agenda, kind of white nationalist approach, is a backlash against race and racism in recent years. And it's okay to be white. It's kind of popularized in far-right circles and nationalist circles in the United States. And these signs were put up all over America in recent years, but they've also made their way over to the English context. So these signs were put up all around Bristol University in January last year. And it's really part of this, as I say, this kind of broader far-right political pushback against race and racism. So it's an incredibly diverse and contentious climate, even before the George Floyd protests. Of course, where we are today with the Black Lives Matter movement, this is something that has greatly affected me. I think in no doubt exacerbated by the fact we've all been kind of at home staring at Twitter on our phones, but it's had a real impact on our lives and how we see race and racism. And I'm really pleased that we're now having these conversations, slightly frustrated that we weren't having them earlier, but I am hopeful that there'll be some real good that's coming out of this current moment and the real renewed interest in engaging with race and racism. So what is race and what is racism? Well, it's absolutely unreal as a scientific category. It was kind of popularized in Enlightenment discourses in the 18th century. So all your favourite philosophers from the 18th century, Kant, Hume, but also John Locke, who you might be familiar with, the concepts, the kind of blank slate, the tabula rasa for the child. All of these had heavily racist ideas about black and white people that were established during this period. It's called European pseudoscientific racism now, but it was mapped onto African people where degrees of lighter and darker phenotypes became the marker of where we were in humanity. Kant, for example, who is and continues to be a very well-renowned philosopher in the current period, you know, his ideas at this time were that if you live in a hotter country, you're stupid because you've got darker skin. But that was the prevailing idea at this time, and it's had such a big influence on how we see race and racism. So it's really, really important that we recognise the unreality of race as a scientific category. However, we absolutely still live race in practice. We live race in our lives, in our everyday moments, experiencing the world in ways that are mediated by racialized social categories and relationships. We all have a racialized identity, a racial identity. And I've got the kind of surprised Pikachu emoji there, because for most Black and minoritized people, that will be obvious, but it's really, really important that I say that. So there is a tension there in understanding race as unreal as a scientific category, but absolutely real in the present moment in terms of how we structure our world with our social categories. And there's a real tension there in understanding that unreality and the reality. For me, I like to use a racial ambivalence standpoint, and that's a really good way of complicating race as both real as a social tool, as something that continues to structure our lives in social ways, but unreal as a scientific category. And we can understand the consequences of race according to racialization, which highlights the processes of racial categories while rejecting this notion of race as fixed, natural, or based in scientific data. There's a follow-up activity for you here, so if you're watching me back, please do pause me. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we all have a racial identity, but for many people that can often go unnoticed. I really want to direct you to Peggy McIntosh's article on white privilege. Just search that in Google and it's the first PDF you'll find. It's 20 years old, so it's a little bit dated, but it's a really, really good way of recognizing the ways in which our privileges affect our lives on a day-to-day basis. And it's something that I'd ask you to reflect on in your own time. Okay, so that's race and racism and also the broader political context. I want to move on now to racism in education. And what I'm pointing to here is the ways in which racism is prevalent in the UK. Not only has it remained the same in the last decade, but statistics show that it has in fact worsened. For instance, a BBC report found that exclusions for racism in primary schools have risen more than 40% in the past decade. You know, I was reading an article in The Guardian this morning. We're never short of articles in The Guardian saying how racism seems to exist, I'm finding at the moment. Statistics show that Black children are both at significantly greater risk of and overrepresented within school exclusions. That should really say that Black children have always been at a greater risk of school exclusions since statistics started. There's been no year in which Black children haven't been at greater risk of school exclusion compared to their other counterparts. Now, this third statistic I've got here, Kawat Bhopal, and she's done a really, really good book on the myths of a post-racial society. She points out that schools aren't actually bound to record how well they're addressing their inequalities, nor are they required to record incidents of racial bullying. So at this point, if you're a parent in a school and you're on your parent committee, please be asking what your schools are doing to be recording incidents of racism and racial bullying and discrimination. It's really, really important that we have these statistics. And if schools aren't bound to do it, they should still be doing it as a matter of duty. It's really, really important that we have evidence of race and racism in educational spaces. All of these statistics confirm an earlier report by Ofsted, and when Ofsted are doing the report on racism, I think you know it's bad, and this was in 2012, and they confirmed what everyone else has shown really, that racial prejudice, language and bullying is commonplace among pupils in schools. You know, I went to school in a predominantly white working class town, and racism was prevalent, absolutely so. It's not something that I realised at that time, and you know, reflecting back on my practice, I was one of 2 out of 200 Black children, and my school experience was very much structured by racial experiences. It's something that I think about quite a lot now. So I really encourage you to reflect back on your educational experiences and think about how race and racism has affected you, or whether or not it's something that you've discussed, or whether it's something that you've not had to think about in your previous life. That's racism in educational spaces, but now I want to turn more closely to racism in the early years. I think what we've seen in the past few years in the policy context within the early years has been a real focus on the gender imbalance of the profession, and also the need to tackle harmful gender stereotypes. I think that's excellent and absolutely should be celebrated, but we need to be focusing on race and racism as well. Black or Black British practitioners make up just a fraction of the early years profession. We really need to be addressing their experiences and focusing on what kind of difference they can make within the profession. It's really, really important that we're doing that. But unfortunately, what we saw in the recent workforce strategy is that there's no reference to the statistics of the profession in terms of ethnicity or race. That's the profession. And I also want to turn our attention now to the early years foundation stage profile results. Now, I'm not going to go on a rant about the merits of assessment itself, but they are intended to provide teachers in making an objective measurement of children's progression before they go to school. What does it say then? That in every year, bar two, in the decade since the OIFSP results have been made available and introduced, Black children have been the lowest achieving overall ethnicity group. And this is perhaps a presentation in itself, but for me, there are two conclusions possible here. Either we believe in this notion of genetic determinism, and that for me is that kind of European pseudoscientific racism, that intelligence may have a biological basis for racial difference in educational achievement, or we accept that even with children in the early years, there is already a level of racial bias at play. It's simply not acceptable that even at 4 years old, Black children are assessed as the lowest achieving racial group, and we cannot separate that from the role of racism in educational spaces. Some of you at this point are probably thinking, hold on, we're absolutely fine because we don't have any Black or minoritized children in our setting. We're all right here because we're all white here. If you see this, challenge it, because for me, it's a form of narrow nationalism, and it's absolutely a privilege as well. If you only care about racism in your village, town, or city, then you're not doing enough to recognize the global struggle to recognize, to end inequality worldwide. The events that happened in America with George Floyd have affected us deeply in the English context. And we need to be really cognizant to the global struggle to end racism, which shouldn't only extend to our town or our city or our nursery setting. This is an issue that affects all of us across the world, and we need to recognize that. Even if you do have 1 or 2 Black children or minoritized children in your setting, their experiences are no less significant than those children who are in more diverse settings. We need to be supporting these children as much as possible. The bottom line here is that racism isn't an elsewhere problem for Black and minoritized people to solve. We all have a stake in this, and we all need to be addressing it as much as possible. So if you see this kind of notion that we're all white here because we're all white here, please do challenge it. Okay, so this is a example that I'm going to share with you now from Jane Lane, and we've looked a little bit about the broader EYFSP statistics. I want to show you how that might occur in practice, and this is an example from Jane Lane's book. It's called Speedy Joe. And I'll just read this out to you because it's an example that I share in all of my presentations when I speak about race and racism. It's a really, really good way of thinking about the ways in which our subtle, often hidden ideas about Black children can have an effect on their later development. So Joe, a 4-year-old boy of Black heritage, African Caribbean heritage, joins a local nursery. He doesn't know any of the other children. He feels a bit shy and so plays alone on a bicycle for a few minutes. He gets braver and starts going quite fast, riding all over the place. One practitioner, Jessica, has a responsibility for Joe and is pleased to see him occupying himself. Although she wouldn't say it, or perhaps does not even know she thinks it, she has an idea that Black boys have difficulty in concentrating and that they like physical activity. Now, Several days later, Joe is still occupied with the wheel toys. Despite the requirements of the curriculum, no one really ensures that he plays elsewhere, not with jigsaws or painting, not working with a group, or even looking at the groups. No other child is unsupervised in this way, but because of Jessica's assumption, Joe has had no opportunity to develop a range of learning skills. Now, Jessica's discrimination here is unintentional, but it is absolutely based in stereotypes, attitudes, and assumptions that are racially driven that can have a serious long-term implication for Joe. And I want you to think about this in relation to the EYFSP statistics that I just showed you. Now, when you go back and look at this in your own time, this is a really good case study to work through in groups. What do you think are those long-term implications for Joe if this kind of practice continues? We know about the school to prison pipeline. I want to include the early years in that as well. There isn't a bubble kind of away from issues of racism in schooling context, but absolutely implicated in that as well. What should Jessica be considering and doing, and who has overall responsibility for this situation? I think it would be really easy to blame Jessica here, and she should hold some of the blame, but you know, in these circumstances, you really need to be having these conversations and taking an overall team approach towards working through this together. You know, these implicit ideas that we have about Black and minoritized children, when we don't have the opportunity to discuss them with others, they can go unhidden and they can result in kind of prejudice and discrimination, which ultimately can affect their educational attainment in later life. Two more examples. This is from my research on Black educators in white settings. Please do go away and read that journal article if you can. It's freely accessible. And there's just two here that I really like, two quotes from two educators I researched with. These interviews were for all of the Black educators that I interviewed. Probably the first time they'd had an opportunity to talk about race and racism. So for them, as much for me, it was a really enlightening moment. And I'll just share this first quote, which I've called "Suddenly I Pop Up." I think with the parents I've met at the moment that are Black, they seem happy to see me. It's like they were hiding everybody away and suddenly I pop up and they're asking, what have you been doing and where have you come from? So yeah, I delight in the fact there's there's relief on their face. I can say, oh, we're not the only ones, or thank God there is someone here I can talk to that looks like me. For me, that quote really emphasizes the importance of representation in our communities. I really want you to stop and think at this point, again, if you've got a colleague, work through this together in your own time. What are you doing within your nursery settings or communities to be ensuring that your spaces are as inclusive as possible to the communities that you are representing? It's a really, really important point that we need to be promoting inclusion and representation as much as possible. Otherwise parents are, you know, where have you come from? Where have you been hiding away? It's a really, really important point that we need to be looking at. And this second quote here is called "Creating Space for Conversations." So this is from a practitioner who, yeah, really shy and really didn't want to talk about these because she didn't know whether it was appropriate to or not. And I'll just read it to you. She says, I think I just hope it doesn't come up to something I have to deal with, you know. It's not like I'm fighting a cause or anything. That's not my life. And when these things come up, it's more like, oh, F's sake. It's just something I can't let it go. And guess I'm going to have to deal with it. But you can never find the right words. So thankfully, I've never had to deal with it. People are just silly. I can't be dealing with them, to be honest with you. So for me, this points to the difficulties around silence in these conversations. You know, for Black and minoritized people working in predominantly white spaces, even talking about race can run accusations of the race card, that you're playing the race card, why are you making everything about race? We really, really need to be having these conversations again as a whole. So I want you to sit here and reflect. Have you in your setting ever broached this topic with the practitioners, with your colleagues, with each other? Would it make you uncomfortable? And why would it do so? I think even if it makes you uncomfortable, we need to be having these conversations anyway, and that's probably something we'll talk about in the Q&A. But we need to live with that uncomfortability, because otherwise we are working with Black practitioners in our settings who don't feel confident in dealing with race and racism when it comes up. And two of these practitioners that I interviewed, they'd experienced quite significant cases of racism, but they didn't know where to turn or who to turn to. They just didn't feel comfortable having these conversations. So it's really, really important that we're taking a proactive approach towards these sorts of issues. Okay, so let me recap my main points. I hope I'm on time. The current broader political climate suggests that even before the Black Lives Matter protests, racism remains a really salient issue in the UK. You know, it's useful to take a racial ambivalent standpoint to understand that idea of race as real as a social tool, but unreal as a scientific category. Oh, I've gone a bit muddled up here. My examples draw attention to how racial discrimination operates in early childhood spaces, quite subtly with Jessica, but more explicitly with those two practitioners. Not discussing race may perpetuate those issues. So it's really, really important that we're having those conversations. The early years is not a bubble. It's not immune to racism. I think this is what Liz was kind of gesturing to in her introduction. We kind of seem to overlook race and racism, the kind of hard words at the expense of well-being and inclusion, but we need to be naming these terms. And I think the earliest foundation stage profiles point towards this. My very final note is just please talk to the children. And if you take one thing away from this presentation is that just go away and talk to them themselves. This is a picture that I took of my 15-year-old sister's phone at Glastonbury a few years ago. And if you can't see the image, it's Obama with a kind of fascist clown image over the top. And for me, this really hit home because I considered myself you know, an anti-racist, someone who does anti-racism, but I didn't recognize it with my own sister because I wasn't having those conversations. And maybe that was some learning that I need to do, that I'm assuming that my friends just understand what I'm talking about and my close family, but actually having those conversations is really, really important. So please, please, please talk to the children about these sorts of issues. There's no such thing as them being too young. It's important that we're having these conversations about difference from a really, really early age to enable positive representation as much as possible. Okay, that's me. Thank you very much for listening, and you can follow me on Twitter at Critical Early Years.
Thank you so much, Shaddai. That was exactly what we needed to start the afternoon. Really enjoyed that. We've had a few questions come through. So I'm going to just go straight into the first question, which is, what do you think of the idea that we should be focusing on the opportunity gap rather than the achievement gap?
The opportunity gap, I'm not familiar with that.
Wow. I don't know particularly what, you know, they're referring to, but maybe in the broad sense of opportunities presented, as opposed to looking at, I guess, the lack of achievement there.
Really good, tough question. Thank you.
Yeah. Starting as we mean to go on. So I guess thinking about opportunities presented, is there a lack of opportunities presented for Black children? And should we be looking at the opportunities that are there or not there, as opposed to, you know, achievement, what it means to achieve in EYFS? Should we be focusing on opportunities? I don't know if that helps in terms of clarification.
Well, I don't think you can kind of, you know, bracket out opportunity from achievement. You know, we should be supporting our Black and minoritized children as much as possible to be achieving their potential. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that is restricted by views and perceptions about how race and racism works and how Black children should be and how they should become in educational spaces. So there is almost a blindness sometimes, I think we're seeing around minoritized children, that we're not allowing them to achieve their full potential. I think, as I showed in the EYFSP statistics, we're already seeing that from a very young age, that practitioners are you know, not really seeing the differences or judging children off the basis of their ethnicity, and that's resulting in quite significant attainment gaps. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. It's quite a difficult one to start off with.
We'll see in the comments. I think, you know, is this where the conversation leads into this unconscious bias? Do you think that's why people are more comfortable talking about unconscious bias as a way of kind of getting out of really realizing that these things are at the forefront of thought processes, which predicate, I guess, the way in which we view Black children.
Yeah, absolutely. And the experience of racism or coming up against racism, we don't, the first time we experience racism, we don't often have the words to name it. So naming racism is a really good way of saying that's what it is and we need to be challenging and addressing it. I'm always frustrated with the kind of well-being agenda because I'm really keen to say that we can't talk about well-being until Black children are well. And for me, that's really, really important that we look at the broader socioeconomic factors around equalities that are holding children back in society.
Totally. Jules?
Thank you. Thank you, Shaddai. I'm just going to say one thing before I ask the next question, which is a couple of people I think were asking about the presentations and the recording again. So just to say they will be on our website afterwards, so you can go back and have a look and revisit. And as Shaddai said, please do, because as you saw in Shaddai's presentation, there are things to actually go back and look at and read and think about and talk about together. Shaddai, a question that was sent through was, why do you think there is such a disparity between the number of white and Black practitioners?
Well, I think it is partly reflected of the population statistics. However, I think what we see when we look at Black practitioners is that experiences of racism often lead them to leaving the sector. Especially, I can think of my own experiences being the only Black practitioner in a really large setting, which is predominantly white staff. And I felt quite excluded at times. And without that support from others, without those conversations about race and racism, without those conversations about how our racial identity affects practice and the broader kind of cultural things that are going on all the time around the political climate around race and racism, I think it can leave practitioners, and especially minoritized practitioners, to leaving the profession. So there are real issues that we need to be having those conversations, and settings should be ensuring that their spaces are as inclusive as possible. So when practitioners come to interview, when Black practitioners come to interview, you can say to them, we actively support anti-racism, we have a policy or a strategy in place to deal with that in practice, and if you came to work with us, we should be supporting you. So there are issues with silence and not having those conversations, but ensuring that your spaces are as inclusive as possible and taking a real proactive approach towards these sorts of things is really, really important.
Thank you.
I've got another question that I'd like to ask Shaddai in light of that, because I often find that in the early years, there's this real leaning towards a tick box culture, not just to do with observation, assessment and achievement, but even to do with anti-racism. So it's the how do we reach the end of this? How do we know we've done it? And I think what Jules had said at the start was really important, to really frame this as a journey. But in thinking about how we begin that, how do we get families who perhaps do not want to speak about race, do not see that it's important for the early years, how do we get them to engage in these uncomfortable conversations that we're always talking about happening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I say at the start that my presentation isn't a tick box, because I need to get you to think about these things on a deeper level before we look at our resources and have we got enough Black books or Black dolls in the home corner. The resources that we use are only ever as good as the practitioners that engage with them. And if practitioners don't have that level of knowledge and understanding about race and racism and inequalities, then we're not going to get very far by just having a few more resources and ticking off a few boxes. And the notion that race and racism is ongoing is really, really important work as well, to say. There's no end to racism anytime soon. So we need to really recognise that, and we'll continue to be having these conversations. We'll continue to get things wrong as well, but we need to keep trying to be better as much as possible. So that's really, really important. And parents that don't want to engage, keep trying is what I would say. Just because they don't want to engage doesn't mean you shouldn't keep trying. We need to be raising these children to become anti-racist, to recognise difference before they go off into school environments and have to figure it out for themselves. We've all been to school, we all know how ingrained inequality is in those settings. The early years is a really good opportunity. I think we're also a lot closer with our parents in earlier settings. We tend to talk to them a bit more at drop off and pick up time. The relationships are there, and there are opportunities that we can be having to take this forward into a staff meeting, sending out a few emails here just to get those kinds of conversations conversations going. Talking to parents is really, really important in promoting a more anti-racist culture. And there are plenty of parents that do want to be having these conversations on anti-racism as well. So get them involved, create a community ethos around this, begin to build a culture of anti-racism within your setting.
Thank you, Shaddai. I've got another question come through. As the only Black practitioner in an all-white team, what piece of advice do you have for me?
Something that I found really important was networks. And I think social media can be quite useful in that aspect as well. You may well be the only Black practitioner in that setting, but there are other Black practitioners in other settings that you can draw upon. I'm leaning towards my kind of men in earlier experience here, when I was also the only token man in my earlier setting, and those feelings of isolation were very much real. So really, really encourage you to reach out and speak with others who may be going through similar experiences to you, maybe facing experiences of racial discrimination and not really sure what to do. Having those conversations with others in a similar experience, in a similar position, would be really, really helpful. But your white colleagues should be supporting you. Just because you're the only Black practitioner in that setting, the onus shouldn't always be on you. And again, this goes back to the all setting approach, that we all need to be playing a role in an anti-racist approach. So please don't be burdened as the only Black practitioner and therefore the only diversity practitioner, the token inclusion person. It needs to be a whole setting approach there.
I think that's often the approach though, isn't it? When you find yourself to be the only minoritized person in any working environment, you're often given the role of being diversity champion. You're often given the role of being EDI, and it becomes really wearisome, because actually when you are part of a minoritized group, you don't necessarily always want to talk about that thing which minoritizes you, and that in itself becomes such a task. It's quite a heavy load to carry. But it leads me on to another question that's come through, Shaddai. Do you think more can be done at the training and CPD level for practitioners?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I said at the start, these kinds of conversations around race and racism and equalities broadly, we're just not having them enough on early years foundation level courses, as far as I'm concerned. This isn't something that I was taught on my apprenticeship level 2, which should have been taught, nor my level 3, nor my foundation degree. It wasn't really until I reflected on these ideas myself and think, okay, what's going on here? Why aren't we having these conversations? I began to realize the effect to which racism and race need to be discussed in early years settings. So absolutely, more CBD is really, really important. And there's some great stuff going online at the moment. It's one of the few benefits of the shift to our online world. I think that there's plenty of CPD out there and resources that you can engage with as your setting as a whole to be championing a more anti-racist approach. But we absolutely do need to be pushing an equalities agenda throughout all early childhood courses within the UK. Yeah. Just
quickly following on from that, Shaddai, because I've noticed obviously there's been a surge of interest in CPD, obviously my own. There has been an interest in local authorities really grasping this as well. What is your view about non-Black practitioners or non-Black facilitators leading anti-racist training?
Good question. I believe that I think I don't necessarily have a kind of an inbuilt issue with it, and I think it's fine. I think there are some really good anti-racist white practitioners who have decades of knowledge and practice. I'm thinking of Gina Houston and perhaps Jane Lane as well, who have that experience of working in predominantly multicultural and really diverse settings. So, representation is good to an extent. It's always useful to have people with lived experience of these issues, but it's not the be all and end all. And I think, white practitioners can deliver anti-racism absolutely fine. So I don't take a hard and fast line on that at all.
Okay, thanks, Shaddai. That's it with the hard and fast questions as well. At this point, I would like to invite everybody to take a 5-minute comfort break, I believe, Jules, as we get ready for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you so much, Shaddai. I really appreciate that. That was the quickest 5 minutes ever. But I'm hoping that you all had an opportunity to go and have a cup of tea, visit the restrooms, and also just, I guess, to decompress. Lots of information there from Shaddai, but as I said, this is the direction that we want to keep things moving in. So as we kind of get on to the next part of this afternoon's conference, I would like to introduce and welcome Faith Chow.
Hi, thank you so much, Liz. And I'm just going to be sharing my screen now. Okay, here we go. So for the next 30 minutes, we're going to be talking about celebrating racial, linguistic, and cultural diversity. So I'm going to give you some things to consider and a starting point for reflective practice. Okay, so we're just going to jump straight into it. So this is an overview. We're going to have a closer look at ourselves, do some self-reflection together, and then think about why we need to celebrate racial, linguistic, and cultural diversity. A closer look at who is in our setting. We're going to be talking about celebrating racial, linguistic, and cultural diversity. And throughout the 30 minutes, I'm going to be giving you some questions for self-reflective practice. And at the end, there's going to be a slide that collates all those reflective questions together that you can screenshot or take a photo of and go away and work on them. So this is me. My name is Faith, like Liz said, therapist. I work in an early years NHS setting, and I'm also the owner of Speech Therapy Fun, which is an independent children's speech and language therapy practice that I'm going to be launching later on this year. So this is who you see on the surface level, on a professional level, but as with everyone, I am a multifaceted individual. There's more to me just than my work. These are some of my identities. So I identify as a British-born Chinese person, so a British-born Hong Kong Chinese person, and I am a cisgender woman. I am a Christian. I am a graduate and a child of graduates and a child of immigrants. So these are different parts of my identities, and there are intersections in these identities as well. So I think it's just important to consider where we come from and who we are, because our identities reflect the way we see the world. It affects the way that we move through the world, and it affects the way how other people perceive and treat us as well. And so there's part of my identities that are marginalized. So because I am a Chinese person, because I'm a Chinese woman, there's that racism and fetishization aspect of it as well. But there's parts of my identities where I hold privilege. So I am a child of graduates, for example. So I think it's just important to self-reflect together and think about who we are and the identities and intersections that we hold, and how that affects actually how we look at anti-racism. So this is our first self-reflection question. So I've got this little image here of a person and a question mark. So every time you see this image, it's going to be a question for you to think about. And I'm not going to be able to have enough time today to pause to give you time to work on and think about the answers to all the questions. But I'd really encourage you to go back afterwards and do the work and think through these questions in your own time, or perhaps with a colleague or a friend. So first two questions: in what ways are you marginalized, and in what ways do you hold privilege? Okay, so another closer look at ourselves, doing some more self-reflection. Where are you on your personal anti-racist journey? So this infographic is really helpful when we're thinking about our anti-racist journey. It is about becoming an anti-racist. And like Jules said earlier, it's not something that we can say we've arrived at. It's supposed to be an ongoing journey, and one I hope that we can go on together. So have a think, where are you on this journey? And so it's important to think, we can't teach what we don't know. We can't raise and educate anti-racist children if we're not in the process of becoming anti-racist ourselves. So yeah, we're not going to get it right all the time. We're not always going to be the most inclusive practitioner or setting for everyone all of the time. But I'd like you not to let the fear of imperfection and of making mistakes and maybe even the overwhelm of, there's being so many things to have to consider to stop you from starting on this journey. So let's learn together, and we can make our settings a more inclusive and anti-racist place for all our children. So I hope, because you're here today, you're watching this, you're attending this conference, that you're probably in the learning zone because you are educating yourself on race and structural racism. Oops. You are listening to others who think and look differently than you. So I know in the early year setting, most people don't look like me. Most people, generally speaking, are white and women. And so, you're here, you're listening, you're educating yourself. So this is part of the learning journey that we're on together today. So racism is everyone's problem. So it's not, like I said, it's not something that, I think he said, it's not for Black and people of color to fix. It is everyone's problem, and we all need to take responsibility to safeguard our children from the harmful effects of racism. So we need to safeguard our children from developing racist thoughts and behaviors and values which uphold white supremacy. If we don't do anything about racism, they're going to develop these harmful values from the world around them, because that's the kind of society we live in, even with the best of intentions. And we also need to safeguard children from being harmed by racism and discrimination and microaggression. So we need to safeguard minoritized children. So it really should be, in my opinion, part of our safeguarding training, because it's so important to keep all children safe. We need to consider the impacts of racism and how we can support our children in our anti-racist practice. Okay. Why do we need to celebrate racial, linguistic, and cultural diversity? So we need to ensure that our settings are a more inclusive place for everybody, and to really acknowledge difference, because there is difference between us and the difference is beautiful. So if we are going with a colorblind approach that actually race doesn't matter, we're all the same, race doesn't matter, it's not an issue, it's not, then we're actually not recognizing the backgrounds and heritages of our children and actually erasing those backgrounds, because our languages, our culture, our ethnicities, they do shape us, and they do shape our children as well. So we need to be including and working on inclusion. And so the EYFS guidance, is big on equality of opportunity and anti-discriminatory practice, and that we should be ensuring that every child is included and supported in our settings. So a question for you: does every child feel included and supported in your setting? And how do you know this? How do you know this? So really working on celebrating how, our diversity is so important to help children feel included and supported. And it is part of these areas of the EYFS as well: personal, social, emotional development, understanding of the world and their identity as well. So next, we're going to have a closer look at who is in your setting. So what is the racial, linguistic, and cultural makeup of your nursery or of your early year setting? So you may be a childminder, or you may be, like me, a speech therapist working in the early years. So what is the racial, linguistic, and cultural makeup of the children that you work with and serve? So it's quite a big question, actually. And some of you might know, which is fantastic. Some of you might not know. So if you don't know, how can we be working on inclusion and diversity if we don't know who we're supposed to be including? And it's important here not to make assumptions. So the languages that families speak might not be the ones that you expect. So from looking at me, if I tell you I speak 3 languages, you're probably going to guess something maybe like English, Cantonese, maybe Mandarin. But actually, I speak English, Cantonese, and Spanish. You can't tell from looking at me. So you can't tell from looking at your children. These are questions that you'll need to ask to find out. And so we can't assume the cultures that children come from as well, or the cultural celebrations that they might celebrate. So children might be ethnically of a certain heritage, but they might culturally not actually celebrate the celebrations that you might expect from that heritage. So we need to kind of we need to know these things. We want to include our children and help them feel included in our settings. Okay, so celebrating racial diversity. So we all have a racial identity, as Shai said, and so it's important that we celebrate that, so that everybody feels that everybody can see themselves represented in the resources that we're using with our children. So we're just going to focus actually on diversity in books for the next few minutes, the books that we use. So yeah, for speech therapists, we can't change formal assessments, but we can consider the resources that we use in our play-based assessments and our informal assessments and our picture description assessments. So we can do things to adapt what we do as well. And so in 2019, 33.5% of the school population in the UK were of minority ethnic origins. In the same year, only 5% of children's books had an ethnic minority main character. In the year before, 2018, that was 4%. In 2017, that was 1%. So that's very, very low, isn't it? So representation really matters. It contributes to how people and how minorities, ethnic minorities, view themselves, and also how society views them. So if we're not showing children themselves in books, and they're not, that doesn't, we need to be showing, diversifying our books so that children can see themselves represented, and represented in a positive way and not in stereotypical ways. So yeah, this will help to empower children and to help with their sense of identity as well, help them to see what they could be, jobs they could do, roles they could play. So an action point for you, a very simple thing, do a diversity check or an audit of your bookshelf, your resources, the toys in your cabinets, and see, are they racially diverse? And also, do they reflect the children in your setting as well? So if you have a majority Bengali, a large Bengali population in your nursery, do you have Bengali books that have Bengali characters in them? So that's important to consider. But also some cautions: diversity does not equal inclusion. So I'll say that again, diversity does not equal inclusion. Just because the books that you choose may have more Black and brown and Asian children in them, it doesn't mean that they're positive representations or that they're inclusive. So there are many books out there which actually reinforce racist and negative stereotypes about children from ethnic minorities. And so it's really important to avoid these racial stereotypes, to prioritize own voices books. So what are own voices books? These are books by someone of a community, a minoritized community, about characters of children of the minoritized community. Sorry, have I explained that correctly? So yeah, for example, a book about a Chinese child written by a Chinese author, that is going to be, so that is less likely going to reinforce racial stereotypes than a book that isn't. And if you check the hashtag own voices on social media, then that is an easy way to find some of these resources. So you do need to kind of do your research a little as well when you are purchasing books. So because most books, like we just saw, there's so few books that are representing children of ethnic minorities. If we don't actually make an effort to find racially diverse books, we're going to do the default, and the default is books that feature animals as main characters and white children as main characters, and children of ethnic minorities won't see themselves reflected. So it really doesn't take that much extra work, but is just being a little bit more mindful. Another cautionary thing to say: books are a tool. They're a tool for anti-racism, they're a tool for equality and diversity. They are not the solution. A book itself cannot be anti-racist. It is, how are you going to be reading that book? And how are you going to be posing questions to your children? How are you going to be making activities that are related to the book and that open up the discussion on race, or open up the discussion for other things that that the book is talking about? So a book in itself isn't enough, but it's a step, and I think it's a step that we need to all take. So I know some of you might ask about specific books, and I'm a bit reluctant to recommend specific books. There are loads and loads of books out there that are diverse, but here are some booksellers, some bookshops that you can look at who sell diverse books. So Lantern Books is an online shop. It's also called Asian Kidlit UK on Instagram, and they are run by a British Chinese mom, and they sell East and Southeast Asian books, most of them in English, about East and Southeast Asian culture. Roundtable Books are a Black-owned bookshop in Brixton, and they sell inclusive children. Have a look at that on their website. Lentana is a publishing company, an inclusive children's publishing company, and they are also a great place to have a look for books. For every one book that you buy from them, they donate a book to a children's literacy charity. So that's a great one to look at. Celebrating linguistic diversity. This is what we're going to be talking about next: bilingualism and multilingualism. So speaking two or more languages. So as a speech therapist and as someone who is multilingual myself, this is something I'm really passionate about, championing bilingualism. And I talk about it nearly on a daily basis in my work as a speech therapist, encouraging parents to speak their home language to their children, as well as English, if they also speak English. So from the last census, 2011 census, 7.7% of the population in the UK had a main language other than English. So, and this is just people who had a main language other than English. They didn't have statistics for people who generally spoke more than one language. So there's a lot of people in the UK who speak more than one language. Most of the parents that I speak to on a daily basis are bilingual or multilingual. And I'm sure many of the families that you work with are also bilingual or multilingual. Okay. So this is some, So this is some information from the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, the RCSLT. So on their page on bilingualism. So some facts here. Bilingualism is an advantage in a person of any age, bilingualism is an advantage regardless of the presence of a speech, language, or communication disorder. So there's a common misconception that children with special educational needs, or autistic children, or children with language delay, that speaking two languages at home is really going to confuse them and we should just speak the one. But that's actually not true. The research shows that's not actually true. Bilingualism doesn't cause or contribute to a speech, language, or communication disorder. It only has advantages. So I think it's become a lot better than before, than when I first started working as a speech therapist, but I still do have parents regularly telling me that their nursery staff have advised them to stop speaking their home language and only focus on English because two languages is confusing to their child and their child is already delayed. Some parents follow this advice, and some parents say to me, I didn't think that advice was right. Can you tell me, is it right? Should I be doing that? I don't want to do the wrong thing. So this is just to let you know, please, please, please champion bilingualism and multilingualism. Don't tell parents to stop speaking in their home language. We need to be encouraging them to speak their home language to their children, because actually children need to learn good and consistent and correct language models and examples in any language for them to be able to have the building blocks to learn language in general and to learn the next language. So having a good foundation in one language will stand them in good stead for learning the next language. And so it's really important that parents are speaking to the children in a language that they're comfortable in speaking and that they're fluent in speaking as well, because that will really help their children when they learn another language. It's also quite common for children, if they've had one language at home and then they start going to nursery where English is spoken, and they've never had English before, to go through a kind of a silent period, a period where they might just be kind of processing what's happening around them, but they're speaking fine at home in their home language. So these children, please don't refer them on to speech and language therapy if they are speaking, as you would expect for a child of their age in their home language. That's a good thing, and English will come later. That will come with time and with exposure. So that's really important to keep in mind. So championing bilingualism, why is it so important? So when we don't champion bilingualism, if we either don't address it and parents continue, from society around them, they just think the best thing to do for their children is to only speak English, and of course parents want to do the best for their children, but if we don't address it and if we don't champion bilingualism, it can lead to the idea unintentionally being given to parents that Englishness is Britishness, whereas we know that's not the case. We live in a multicultural society. You can be British and you can be Chinese, you can be British and you can be Black Caribbean. You can speak different languages and more than one language and you're still British. So we want to dispel that idea, and we also want to dispel the idea that accents are bad, and that minority languages are inferior. So if we don't champion bilingualism, people might will have this idea that, okay, my home language is not as good, I really need to speak in English because it's the best thing for my child, or maybe bilingualism is confusing, and some shame around the minority languages. Cultural erasure could happen. Language, which impacts on the way that they're able to relate to or to communicate to their elders. So what we do want to do is champion bilingualism, empower parents with the knowledge that they can and should, and it's a wonderful gift to be able to speak more than one language, and they should hand that gift on to their children. Be able to grow up being simultaneous bilinguals, having two languages at once, and it'll help children with their sense of identity, their connection to their family, to their culture, to their heritage. Those are really important things. So I would encourage you to take active steps to champion bilingualism in your settings with your families. And yeah, so that's an action point for you. And how can we do this? So there are many ways that we can do this. This is just one example. You can provide them with information. So on the National Literacy Trust website, they provide this booklet, Time Together, Fun and Simple Activities to do with your young child at home in 13 languages, and it's all for free. You can just make a username and download them. You can put them on Tapestry, you can send them home to parents. It's a really helpful resource and some fun and simple activities for children that will help with their general development. But if they have it in their home language, that's really empowering parents, isn't it? And really, really positive. And they have lots of other leaflets too about different activities. Also, in specifically, if you don't want to give them a whole booklet or print out a whole booklet, they have just handouts as well in lots of different languages. So you can think about, once you've identified what are the languages that are spoken in the families, in my nursery setting, in my speech therapy setting, in my childminder setting, what languages are being spoken at home, and then you can think, okay, well, I can provide this information to these families if they read in this language to them if they would like, and that's another resource you can provide. How are we doing with time? I forgot to put my timer on. I think it should be fine. Okay. Celebrating cultural diversity. So I think this is something that nurseries and early year settings, are really big on. And things are celebrating cultures all around the world, and teaching children about cultures all around the world. And I say cultures all around the world and not other cultures, because we don't want to be othering children and making them feel like their culture is other. It's very different to us, because who is us actually? If I'm working in that setting, us, I'm not white. It's the idea of us, of normal and other cultures. We need to be careful about our language and be sensitive around the language that we use, and that we're not celebrating other cultures. We're celebrating cultures. We're celebrating all cultures. That's a little bit of a side note. But yeah, so we do want to carry on celebrating traditions, celebrating cultures. But what we want to avoid is tokenizing children or perpetuating harmful stereotypes about cultures. And I know this is, that this will not have been done with, any bad intentions. And early years practitioners, and people who work in early years, we're not here for the money. We're here to serve our children. That's why we've chosen this particular profession, isn't it? So we all come in with good intentions. But actually we need to recognize that we can sometimes get it wrong, and sometimes getting it wrong can be quite an othering experience for children and their family harm. So let's take Lunar New Year as an example. So how did you celebrate Lunar New Year in your early year setting? This is a reflective question for you. Okay, how did you celebrate, if you celebrated? Okay, so here's an example. Do you see anything wrong with this? This is a real life example that someone I know in my community shared with me. So this is about a child that she knows in her family. So about the only child, this child is the only Chinese child in her reception class, and I've been given permission to share this and the other examples I'm going to give. So I'm just going to read it out. During Lunar New Year, her class were introducing the festivities to the children, and the teacher said, "You must be the little expert about Chinese New Year in our class. What do you do at home in Chinese New Year?" So that might sound like quite an innocuous question. Have you found yourself asking these questions before? Let's have a think. But in this case, I'll just actually read it. The poor girl didn't know a thing about it, as her family don't practice traditions much. And she said, We do nothing, just eat and nothing else. And the teacher didn't feel the awkwardness and kept on asking, what special food you eat? So what is wrong here? What do we see that's wrong here? So this child, she's very young. I know it's not early years reception, but she's being asked to represent her culture. You know, she's been put on the spot, asked to represent her perceived culture, asked to think and to process and to you know, find that information in her head. Okay, what do we do? And also to think, okay, what do we do for Lunar New Year specifically? Maybe that other people don't know about. And she's asked to regurgitate this to an audience. And actually, her family don't practice those traditions so much. So there's that assumption there, the assumption that this child will be an expert in Chinese New Year and that she will actually be an expert and be comfortable to share and able to share. That's also quite a large language load that you're putting on a child for them to be able to represent their culture and recall information like this. So that's quite a difficult question to ask, but also it shouldn't really be a question we're asking a child to represent their whole culture to their class. So, you know, for this child, she did respond, but, you know, it seemed to be very uncomfortable for her. So I would like you to think about, you know, have you done this before? And actually, what could you do differently next time? So some children might be happy to share, but I would implore you not to put children on the spot and expect this. It's far better to ask their parents if they would be happy to come and share something. So some more examples, we won't have time to go through them all, so you can look back on these slides in your own time as well. So the one at the top, actually, I'll talk about this briefly. This is a friend of mine. She is Korean and she's in her 20s now, but she told me this example of what happened to her when she was at nursery in England. They called it Chinese New Year. She said the nursery staff called it Chinese New Year and said that she couldn't celebrate if she was Korean. So these might not be the exact words that the nursery staff said to her, but this is what she felt. This is what, you know, and this is what she's carried with her for so many years. It's had this impact. So if you don't know Korean New Year or Seollal, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, it's celebrated at the same time as Chinese New Year. So actually I have called it a Lunar New Year today. And that's learning for me. I've always called this festival Chinese New Year because I'm Chinese, that's my experience. But something I've learned this year is actually Lunar New Year is a much more inclusive term because there are many East and Southeast Asian cultures, like in Korea and in Vietnam, who celebrate New Year during the same time because we all follow the lunar calendar. So actually, do you call it Chinese New Year or do you call it Lunar New Year? And what will you call it next year? The second example is about a friend of mine. Her nursery sent this message to parents about Chinese New Year, clearly had very good intentions of celebrating it. You know, they have a child who is Chinese, but they were giving the opportunities for children to dress in traditional Chinese costumes. Do you see anything wrong with Chinese costumes? So our culture isn't a costume, our clothes aren't a costume. This is my personal opinion, and opinion I know that many other people also hold. But this is not something that you would do. I would hope you would not do for other cultural celebrations, like for Hanukkah, for example, or for Black History Month. You're not going to ask children to dress up in a costume that's supposed to represent that culture. So you can respect and appreciate the costumes and learn about, not the costumes, like the clothing, and learn about the clothing, but please don't get children to dress up as Chinese people. That's not really appropriate. And the last one, I'm just looking at time, we don't have time to go into that. You can do some research in your own time about fortune cookies and why that's not actually representative of Chinese people in general. So what harm might have been caused in the children by celebrating Lunar New Year in these ways? So that's another self-reflective question for you. what harm might have been caused. And the fact especially that these experiences, one of them was by someone shared with me their experience over 20 years ago, what harm might have been caused. And how might your setting have celebrated Lunar New Year in a way that was unintentionally harmful? So it's important to reflect on it. And I know this might be very uncomfortable to reflect on something that maybe you haven't gotten right, that has unintentionally caused harm to students and children. But if we don't reflect on what we've done wrong, we won't know what we can do to make things better next time. And this is applicable to all cultures. So I'd like you to think about, I wanted to bring an example that is personal to me as somebody who has been through the UK system and has education system. And yeah, I mean, I won't share my own personal experience here of how Lunar New Year was celebrated in my school, which was quite othering, but there's many people who have experiences like these, which as a child, you're not able to put your finger on and think, why does this not feel right? Why do I feel embarrassed? This feels all icky. We don't have, minoritized children don't have the language to explain these, or maybe even to share with their families, but maybe later on in adulthood, they can reflect back and think, hang on, that wasn't quite right. And it made me feel this way. And that's something that people still remember. So that's something I would encourage you to think about when we're thinking about how can we make our early year settings an inclusive place? How can we make sure that everyone feels included? This is something really important to think about for all children from all cultures. Okay. So celebrating, cultural diversity, there we go. So caution, don't ask children to perform their home language. They might not actually speak that language as strong, fluently, and also don't ask them to perform their culture for you. Don't single out people of color children, or actually any minoritized children, including children who are white from Gypsy and Roma and traveler communities. Don't single out any children to speak for their assumed culture. I think that would read better. Don't single out any children. Please don't treat traditional cultural clothing like a costume. Please treat them with respect. And action points, things that you can do to celebrate cultural diversity. Do plan ahead for cultural celebrations and do your research. So you can find calendars for cultural celebrations online and plan ahead. And do invite parents to come in and share something about their cultural celebration. Families from all kinds of backgrounds, and listen to them. Listen to them if they tell you something that you've gotten wrong. Listen to them if they point you in a direction that you maybe would not have gone down, because you didn't know about that part. And just acknowledge that they're the experts in their culture. And if they would like to, they're welcome to share, but don't pressurize people to do so. And actually sending a message out on Tapestry, for example, to all parents about if anyone would like to share something from their experience about X culture is, I feel, more helpful than singling out parents, because actually there might be some parents of that cultural background that you don't know about. Maybe some that are racialized as white, but they're actually mixed race, and you don't know that actually that part of their cultural heritage is really important to them. So invite parents to come in and share something instead of asking their children. So use activities written by educators and authors of the community that you are seeking to celebrate in your activities. So I know Twinkle and is used a lot. Also, Teachers Pay Teachers in the States. We might have people watching from the States. I have seen some quite problematic and questionable things on these websites about cultural celebrations, and sometimes I have wondered who has written this, because this is actually misrepresenting. So please do find activities from the community of the people that you want to celebrate, and there's loads out there, and you can just do a quick Google search. It's really encourage that. So planning ahead is key. So wrapping up now, becoming an anti-racist is a lifelong journey. It's not something that we can say and tick off that we've done because, you know, we've read a certain book or we've come to this conference, for example. It's a lifelong journey that we all need to go on, and we are all going to be at different stages of our anti-racism journey. Personally, for me, I feel like I am in the early years of my lifelong anti-racist journey. There's still a long way to go, a lot more to learn, but acknowledge where you're at, identify where you're at, and take steps towards going into the right direction and keep at it. Don't expect to become an anti-racist overnight or to have a complete transformation of your education setting all in one go. It's a journey, so take steps towards the right direction. Okay. And so what one thing, so I've asked lots of self-reflection questions today, but if there's one thing you take away, actually, could you get a pen and paper right now if you don't have one already? Please write down what one thing are you going to start to do today or in the next week or so to make your classroom or setting a more inclusive place. So what one thing will you start to do, and give yourself a timeline for when you're going to start to do that. However it is, I know, people are very busy, but this is something that we need to prioritize. So give yourself a goal and give yourself a time that you're going to set to do that. How will you make sure that you keep on going on this anti-racist journey? Do you need other colleagues to be involved as well, so you can work on this together? Do you need your management involved? If you are a manager, do you need to, and you're in a position to do so, are you able to seek support for your team? What support might you need? Might you need to employ and contract an anti-racist educator and consultant, for example, Liz? I haven't been asked to say that, but I think that would be really valuable if that's something that you're able to do in your setting. Has to start, becoming anti-racist needs to start with your self-reflection and understanding where your own privileges are, understanding where your own biases are, and dismantling your own biases too. So I have really focused on things that you could do, because I know we're here to talk about anti-racism in the early years, but you can't really focus on becoming an anti-racist educator if you're not becoming an anti-racist person. So you need to do both of these things hand in hand. And there are so many resources out there for learning to become an anti-racist. So just, I would really recommend you to do that, to go and explore that. So this is bibliography, so you can go back and look at this information as well. So these are the self-reflective questions that I have asked today. Feel free to screenshot this or take a photo of this if that would be helpful to you. These slides are also going to be uploaded to the Tapestry website after today's conference, so you can go back and work on them. This talk has been very short, so I've kind of given a quick overview of things, but I really would recommend and say that you have to really, to get anything out of the session, to ask yourself these questions and work through them, and do the work in that respect. So this is just a snapshot of things that you can be reflecting on, but I think it's a good place to start. Diversity and inclusion is not the be all and end all of anti-racism. This is a place to start, and I know that's what I've been focusing on this session, but this is a place that you can start at. Okay, so that is it for my talk today. Thank you for learning with me. And so these are my contact details. My Instagram is @speechtherapyfun. This is my email. If you want to get in touch with me, just send me an email. As I said, I am launching my speech therapy independent services later on this year. It will be on the website, but if you want to hear about when that will be, just check on my Instagram and I will put the info out there. So yeah, thank you for listening and thank you for learning with me today. Do we have any questions?
Thank you, Faith, so much. That was, as I listened to that, that was real reflection in action going on in that presentation with those moments to pause and to go back for people to go back and look at. So thank you. We've had so many questions. I'm going to launch straight in to this one. How can we make sure that we support our children during their anti-racism journey when we ourselves have only just started?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And yeah, I think it's great that you're acknowledging that's where you're at, the person who asked that question, that you've just started, and that there's room to grow and things to learn. And we learn by practicing. There's not going to be a time when we think, okay, I am now 80% anti-racist, I'm ready to start working with my children. Those children might have left your nursery by then, and you've missed that opportunity. And so don't let that fear of not knowing enough stop you from supporting your children. But also, I would encourage this person to carry on learning about your own anti-racism journey, but also learn from people who are going to teach you about anti-racism in the early years. How can you support your children in your setting? And then you can do those things alongside each other. So I learn a lot from Liz. She hasn't asked me to say this, but I learn a lot from Liz. If you're not following Liz already on Instagram, you need to do so. She's got webinars that you can follow and watch regularly, that will teach you how to support children on their anti-racism journey in the early years. So doing those things alongside your own personal learning is really vital. And yeah, I would encourage them to take the first step and start somewhere.
Thank you, Faith. I've just transferred that money, that fee for you, I appreciate that. So one other question. There used to be a focus on having signs, messages, labels up in settings in a variety of languages. How important is this?
Who are the signs for? I think that's important to think about.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so are the signs for your children? Are they actually reading it? Are they performative to say that, oh no, we've got an inclusive and multilingual nursery? Are the signs actually for parents to help them to access information that that English-speaking, English-reading parents do have access to? In that case, yes, I think that's really, really important. If you're giving information out to parents about their children's development, about their IEPs, and that parent doesn't speak that language, in that case, it's helpful. I know it's not always possible, and it's not, to translate everything, but if that's what you're thinking, kind of signs and information for parents, and I would say yes, if the setting can provide that, brilliant. I think, is that what they're asking, do you think, about signs for parents?
I think either way, you've answered in all kinds of areas, because we have to think about whether there is a performative element of it, as you said. What is the purpose? Who is it to help? Who is it to instruct? Who is it to guide? So I think in terms of just the answer that you've given, that gives enough information. And obviously, if the person feels that they want a bit more explanation, they know where to find you, as you've left the information there. Because there have been so many questions, Jules, I think you'll agree, we're going to leave it there. And as I said, anybody that directly wants to speak to Faith can contact her. She'd left all of her contact details on the last slide. And what I want to do is just really seamlessly move into the next section, which is a conversation, if you may, between myself, you, Faith, and also inviting Shaddai to come back. Jules, you can leave.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you all.
So, guys,
I overran there with my talk, so sorry for anyone who had questions to ask me, but I think it's really valuable to keep this panel discussion.
Of course, definitely. And I wanted to kind of bring us all back together, as there's been so much things that we have shared, things that we have spoken about off screen, and conversations that we've had. But I just kind of want to bring everybody into our space now. Shaddai, what have been some of your reflections as you've gone through this afternoon, this past 2 hours?
Yeah, it's been really exciting, hasn't it? I've just been going through the comments on Twitter, and there's been a real sort of interest in this. So that's been fantastic. Faith, I loved your presentation. I thought it was really, really good, reflecting on bilingualism. You know, the importance of celebrating, but also educating about those festivals feels really, really important to me. Having a real understanding of the cultures that we're working with. So I've learned a lot, certainly.
I think that's really testimony, isn't it, to say, if we're at a stage that we feel that we are in terms of our own journey and we're still learning, that is really, it's an important thing to highlight. I too enjoyed the presentation, Faith, and learned a lot, because I know I talk about like the 4 E's of anti-racist practice, and one of those 4 E's asks you to think about the child being a unique child and being the expert in who they are in terms of their identity. And I just thought, as you were talking, how that would be interpreted, because when I talk about the child being the expert of who they are to lead in kind of practice, I really guess what it made me think about when you were speaking is, how would that be interpreted? How would that then be delivered in practice? Because it isn't about, as you said, letting the child go and speak their home language because, oh yeah, you know what to do. You do this all the time, and not putting that load on, rather to be led by that child in the sense of, you know, this is what I want to do.
How they play. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely agree. And thank you, Liz and Shaddai. And yeah, I also want to say, Shaddai, I loved your talk. I really learned a lot from you as well. And I really want to read into all those resources that you sent around. And also that the resource that you put about identifying your own biases, privileges. I can't remember what it was. That was excellent. So I really encourage anyone. Peggy McIntosh, yeah, that's really, really, really excellent self-reflective questions, which I'm all about. Really encourage anyone to definitely go and look at that. That was really eye-opening, Shaddai.
As I think, sorry, Shaddai.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, as I was thinking about us all being here on the screen, I thought, wow, this is nice. I feel seen just because I see you. And even though we all operate in different kind of intersections with regards to our identities, there is a unity here. There's a level of feeling comfortable that I don't see in the early years, and I don't often experience in this virtual space that we're now in. And I just think about that in terms of, you know, you spoke about what are our visible and invisible identity markers. And what spaces do we occupy when it comes to thinking about the early years as a sector? I really want to take a deep dive, basically, into kind of getting through and past this conversation around books and Black dolls. How do we do that, Shaddai? How do we do that deep dive?
Yeah, it's a really good point. You know, and I said in my presentation that it's not a tick box, and I'm not going to give you kind of resources to go away. And some people might read that negatively, but I'm really happy to share with you my slides and my information. I'm just not going to give you a kind of do this, and this will solve racism, as if racism can be solved that way. You know, and it's a weird position, us being here, Liz and Faith, you know, we're kind of positioned as the experts on that. I don't feel that way of myself. You know, I'm still getting it wrong. I'm still learning. So there's no such thing as the ideal anti-racist person. We will continue to keep learning together. It's really, really important that we recognize that, whether we are at the start of our journeys, just exploring that with our curiosity, whether you're going to go away now and look at some of the resources in your own time after this session, or whether a little bit further along and you've done some reading and you feel confident to have those conversations. We're going to keep getting it wrong. There's no perfect anti-racist person. We really need to keep that in mind as we take these conversations forward. But as long as we're doing it with the right intentions, that's really, really important.
I think there is something to be said, Faith, about how whiteness operates in this space. And I think about some of the concepts that we introduce, some of the concepts that we speak about. When I say we, me and you, Faith, because we've had a lot of conversations about how whiteness operates in the early years. And I guess as somebody who is from the Southeast Asian community, whose heritage is rooted in something where we've seen white supremacy at play, very much so, you know, recently with what's been going on globally. And also, I guess, the impact of Lunar New Year being quote unquote celebrated in our early years settings. You spoke about the othering. And I just want to kind of get your thoughts about that with relation to how whiteness operates in the early year space as you see it.
Yeah, and I think I felt othered most of my life. You know, there were many. There were some, but not many. Especially when I was in primary school, there weren't really any. Maybe children of East and Southeast Asian descent in my class. And yeah, I mean, you know, you were talking about how whiteness operates. Whiteness and white superiority complex and white supremacy. I know these are very difficult words to hear if you're hearing them and you're feeling uncomfortable. Just sit with that a bit, you know, bear with us, because the idea that whiteness is the best and that is the norm isn't something just that happens here in the UK, and that happens in countries where, you know, there are more white English people, and that's, you know, that's yeah, it happens also in places abroad. Like I'm Hong Kong Chinese, I said, British Hong Kong Chinese. I spent the years between 2 and 9 in Hong Kong. I attended a school, and I still wanted to be, I was in the majority there, I still wanted to be white. I still wanted to have blonde hair and blue eyes. That's how. Oh, am I frozen?
No, you're fine. You froze for a little bit, but then you carried on. No, now you're frozen. Okay. I think it really speaks to, though, how whiteness and white superiority complex, which we often use as a replacement of white supremacy, how that really permeates even children's identities outside of contexts where, you know, it isn't the majority. And it really kind of, it bothers me, it really upsets me. I find it really a hard concept to reckon with, because that in itself shows the level of urgency around anti-racist practice. And I know, Faith, when we think about, you know, Joanna Ho's latest book, which I know we were really excited about and we were talking about, I don't know if you've come back now, so I don't know if you want to kind of talk to that. Yeah, I was going to grab my copy too and put it in the camera. But seeing, you know, having that book, seeing that now, how did that make you feel?
I cried. If you haven't seen this book, it's called Eyes That Kiss in the Corners by Joanna Ho, illustrated by Zung Ho. And it is about a little girl who have eyes that look like mine. She has a family that looks like mine. You know, there's her grandma. And it concludes that, you know, her eyes are a revolution. What I think that's what it says. You know, my eyes that kiss in the corners and glow like warm tea are a revolution. And that for me is so empowering as an adult who hasn't seen myself reflected in children's books, but also in adults' books. This was so powerful. And yes, my eyes are a revolution. We're not just, it's okay to be different. And that's what Joanna, the author, was saying. This is not the message of her book, that it's okay to be different, because actually who you're saying that East Asian children are different too, who are you saying are the norm? You know, our eyes are a revolution. You know, it's so empowering, and I think that's just, yeah. Totally. I mean, there are so many messages in that book and so many ways that you can look at it, but for me, that was my immediate takeaways. And I think having a book like this available in your nursery settings is so important, but also how are you going to have conversations about the book, about the diverse books that you have?
Definitely.
How are you going to open up that conversation and frame that conversation?
So that's the thing, isn't it? That's the next part. And that's what we were saying, Shaddai. We can give people a list of books to get and a place to get all of these different multicultural, diverse books. And I noticed when some of the questions were coming in, a lot of them were just about, where do we get these books from? And this, I think, is where the laziness comes in. And when we talk about people who are racialized as white in the early years, using us as mules, as the experts because we've spoken about it and we're vocal about it, there is this absolute reluctance to just actually use Google, you know, and I say it as it is, you know, that is what that is. It's a search engine. So when we're thinking about questions which are really basic about where do we get these books from, I appreciate that you put that in your presentation, Faith, you know, absolutely. But Shadow, when we're thinking about, as I said, these deeper explorations of racial literacy and bringing race and anti-racism to the forefront, where does that leave you feeling?
You're absolutely right there, Liz. I think the books that we use and the resources that we engage with are only as good as the practitioners and their knowledge of the resources. So it's all well and good having 2 or 3 books with black characters on shelves, but if they're not being used and if they're not being modelled by practitioners, if they're not being engaged with or celebrated, they're pointless as far as I'm concerned. So that really goes back to the nature of education, and practitioners need to be doing their own learning before they're engaging with resources. Otherwise, it just becomes tokenistic at the end of the day. And we can also apply it to festivals when we cannot celebrate festivals. That's absolutely fine, but we need to understand why we're celebrating these festivals and doing the work and the education to understand why these festivals are important to the families that celebrate them. So we can't celebrate unless we educate, and for me that's a really, really important distinction.
I love that. We can't celebrate until we educate. I want to make sure that we are doing this in a timely fashion, and we haven't had nearly half as long as I'd want to have with this discussion, but I'm just hoping it's a starter and it's food for thought. So I'm going to invite you, Shaddai, Faith, to turn your cameras off, to turn your mics off as I close this afternoon's event. Thank you so much for that conversation. I really appreciate it. And as we draw to the end, of course, we've got lots of food for thought. We've got lots of things that have hopefully made you feel uncomfortable and you've moved through it. You stayed with us until the end. You've thought about your own practice, but also reflected on perhaps some of the things that you have seen, and perhaps thought about times when you've been silent and not spoken up because you didn't want to offend, or you didn't want to get into a conversation which was going to be confrontational. But think about all of the buzz terms and words that we have become accustomed to in the past year. The most famous, doing the work, even Prince Harry used it in his interview. Thinking about being an ally, what does that mean? What's it about? Thinking about all of the books that have been released, the absolute wealth of literature that's out, not just for children, but also for people who are doing this kind of engagement in terms of anti-racism. There are so many things and resources that have been produced by lots of different people globally. And I think we have to get used to now accessing those things as a way and a tool to ensure that we are doing that own internal processing about what all of these things mean to all of our children, because it isn't just about taking that stance because you have a few children who are not white. It is equally as important to do this work if you are in a setting which is majority or all white. We understand that there are lots of different types of settings in rural parts of the world. And it's funny how the word rural becomes synonymous with white, and the term inner city becomes synonymous with black and brown. And think about that language. Think about what that means, and think about where your mind takes you. It has been an absolute pleasure to co-host this afternoon. This past 2 hours have been so important, so powerful. And I use that word because that's the word that comes to mind. And that's the word that makes me think about the progress that can be made. I said at the start when I was speaking to Jules, it's bittersweet because sometimes it feels like too little too late. I think, did it take for somebody to be murdered on the other side of the world for us to really wake up? Was it about the fact that we were in lockdown, or was there a reckoning with everybody's conscience? Whatever the reason, we're here now, and we must keep up this momentum. It is so important. If you're really invested in children, if you're invested in the unique child, if you're invested in ensuring that you are not going to be walking into this place of being quiet and just hoping that things will just blow over, it's not going to happen. And it's certainly not going to happen whilst I am in the sector, or my colleagues at Tapestry, FSF, or of course my colleagues Faith and Shaddai. This is our work. Have a fantastic rest of the evening, and thank you so much for joining us today. Take care.